segment, we're going to look at controlling your media with JavaScript. Using JavaScript gives you a lot more control over the media, and it also doesn't force you to use the built-in controls that appear in the device or the browser. I've already set up an iOS application, and I've put my media, caro.mp3, into the application itself. So we're going to go ahead and load our index.html into our text editor, and we're going to get started. I should note that the video and audio APIs that are used in HTML5 mobile development are just about identical. So even though we're doing an audio example here, this could just as easily be applied to video with not a whole lot of changes. Audio just happens to be a little easier, smaller, so I'm working with that in this example. All right, so almost got rid of the templated stuff that I don't want. I'm going to move this script up to the head, and we should be ready to go. Perfect. All right, so now here in the body, I'm just going to start by putting a couple of buttons that can be used to play the music. So we'll call this btn play. We'll write on the button play. And of course, we have a play button. We probably also need a pause button. And last but not least, we need a stop button. All right, so 3 buttons. I'll put a couple of breaks in here, so maybe these appear on 3 different lines. Doesn't really matter. We certainly could add a bunch of CSS to style this and make it look just about any way we wanted to, or use custom graphics for our buttons. So we have these 3 objects, so now let's go ahead and create our own script. So I'll open and close with script tags. All right, so now window load equals function. You've seen this pattern a number of times. And here we're going to attach to the document the event listener. We're going to listen for device ready. And when it is, I'll call a function called init. I'll set that to false. And then we have our init function. Now, since we're going to be testing in the actual local browser here, at least initially, I'm actually going to make a little modification I make for local testing. I'm going to go ahead and comment this guy out, and I'm just going to call init. Now, the reason I'm going to do that is because in the actual browser on your computer, you don't have a device-ready event. So that would never be called and would never load init. So then when I'm ready to deploy onto a device, I just switch out these double slashes onto init, and run line 29, and that runs the init function on the device. All right, so here in init, we're going to have to get our 3 buttons and put events on them. All right, so let's do that. So I'm going to go ahead and call document get element by ID, btn play. We're going to add an event listener. We're going to listen for the click event. We're going to call a function called play music, and use capture will be false. Now, in an actual application, I'd be more likely to call a singular function for all 3 buttons. However, for the purpose of this course, I'm going to call 3 separate functions. So button play will call a play music function. Button pause will call a pause music function. And as you may have guessed, button stop will call a stop music function. All right, and now we can actually write the signatures or stubs for these 3 functions. So function play music Then we're going to have pause music and stop music. Okay, so we've got this much done. Now, believe it or not, we still need the audio element. So remember the audio element here. We're going to do our audio element. But I'm not going to set controls equals to controls. I'm going to set controls equals to false this time. And here inside the audio element, I'll now set my source file. Source equals, and then the name of the actual file, which you'll remember is caro.mp3. And then we need our MIME type. And as I talked about previously, also a good idea to have a second source. I'll move that over in a second. Type equals audio./ogg. And at this point, we've got our audio element. I'm going to go ahead and ID this as player. Now, the reason I'm going to do that is when we go back here into init, we're going to have to create a reference to that player. So here, let's go ahead and create a player variable. And here in init, let's go ahead and assign it. So player equals document get element by ID. Player. So that matches this ID, and so player becomes the reference for the actual player. So then, here, all we've got to do is say player.play. For pause, player.pause. Now, there is no stop method, so I'm for right now going to put player.pause here as well. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. But let's take this point to go ahead and load this up in a browser and see if we have any errors. Wouldn't be surprised if we do. Matter of fact, I see a red line right here. Oops, that's because I put a semicolon there. It doesn't belong there. All right, so let's load this up in a browser and see if we get any errors. Just to prepare for the eventuality that we do, I'm going to go ahead and open up Firebug and Console. It's a great plugin. We'll hit play. And got no errors, but also got no music. So probably not a real good result. So a couple things we can do here. Normally, I would go ahead and test and make sure, are we running these actual functions? So let's go ahead and go right here into init. And I'm simply going to say alert in init. This is a debugging technique. It allows you to trace and make sure you're running all the functions you think you're running. All right, so in init, we know init is running. That's good news. So I can take this out, and let's see if the play music function is running when we click. So I'm going to hit player, I'm going to hit alert in play music. And sometimes you've got to do this type of manual trace, good, to see where the problem is. All right, so if we're in play music, player.play isn't working. That means that there's some problem with the way we set up our player. So let's scroll down here. And I notice I spelled controls wrong. CONTROLS equals false. ID equals player. That certainly could be screwing us up. Let's go ahead and try it here. We'll refresh. Hit play. And our play button, for some reason, ended up way out there. Let's see if we can correct that as well. And still not getting a good result. And now in looking at this and realizing that my code's okay, I realize there's probably a silly error in here. and there is, I forgot to put the OGG file into the actual folder. So now it should play okay, because every test came back correct. So let's try it one more time now in Firefox. We'll save, turn up the volume a little bit here, we'll play. We'll pause, we'll play. So now, notice our controls showed up. And that's because actually we don't want to have controls equals false. We actually, if we take out controls equals false altogether, and instead of having controls equals controls, let's refresh, and now it disappears. So now when we hit play, you may be able to just hear the first strains of the music in the background. I'll keep it playing as we go here. And there's the audio. Again, somewhat difficult to hear, but it is playing. Does pause work? Yep, it sure does. So we're good to go so far. So the next thing we want to do is figure out the situation with stop music. Now, pause, of course, continues playing where you already are in the song. Stop resets you to the beginning of the song. Now, since there is no stop, stop becomes a combination of pausing, which pauses you exactly where you are, and then resetting the playhead so the song playhead is positioned differently inside the song itself. And in this case, we're going to want to position it at the beginning or position 0 seconds or milliseconds. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set player.currentTime, and I'm going to set that to 0 on the stop. So now what's going to happen is, I guess we'll run this from here, is that when we play, and we'll let that play out a little bit, and press pause, it'll pause the music exactly where we are. But when we stop, it should restart the song back at the beginning, the very first strains. So there's our opera singer singing her aria. I'm going to pause. And when I hit play, it continues from that very spot. When I stop now, so of course the stop set our player.currentTime back to 0. So when I play again, we start at the very beginning. So that's perfect. I'm going to add a couple of elements to our audio player. I'm going to use a slider in order to show us the current position in the song. So as the song continues, the slider will move. Now, this requires that we update constantly the position of the player, because we want it to move as the song continues. There's a couple of different ways to do this. I'm going to show you the set interval method, which lets us create an interval and have something occur at that interval. So we'll basically set an interval of, let's say, 100 milliseconds, and at each time at 100 milliseconds, we'll update the slider. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the slider down here. Input type equals, and it's called range, and we'll set the minimum to 0. Now the maximum will be the length of the song in milliseconds, but I'm not going to set that here. I'm going to set that a little bit later. I'm going to ID this as song slider. All right, so just so you have a reference here, so you know what it looks like, there's not going to be any functionality yet, but there's the slider. Actually, it doesn't work in Firefox, so let's try it in Chrome. Some of this HTML5 stuff is so new, it's actually implemented in the mobile devices before it's implemented in many of the browsers. There we go. So there's our slider. And let's set the initial value to 0. This way, the slider positions itself at the beginning of the song. There we go. So we'll refresh. There we go. Perfect. So what I'm going to do is have this move to indicate our position of the song. So of course we're going to have to read current time as well. So let's go ahead and set up our interval on which we're going to adjust the position of the slider. Now, it probably makes the most sense to set this up when we play the music, because we don't want the interval running before the music is playing. So let's go ahead and create, actually, I'm going to make this a global. We're going to create a variable called myInterval. And myInterval is going to be the reference to this actual interval that we are going to be using. All right, so play music. So now myInterval equals, and I'm going to use the setInterval method. For setInterval, the first argument that we give it is the function name, which is going to be update, and then the delay, which is going to be 100 milliseconds. So now on the update function, now what we're going to do is here we're going to update the slider. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to get the current time of the player. So let's go ahead and let's call this song time equals player dot current time. And then we're going to set the value of the slider. And remember, we gave our slider the ID song slider. So we're going to get that guy. Making a mess here for a change. And we're going to set the value equal to song time. Now, the thing we haven't done yet is set the maximum value of the slider. Remember, down here we set the minimum to 0, but we also have a maximum property. So we're going to have to set that in an appropriate place, and I think that appropriate place is play. So now document get element by ID song slider dot, and now we need to set the maximum or minimum here. So dot max equals, and now we can get the actual duration of the song. And that's easy enough to do because we just use player dot duration, which gives us the duration of the song in the player. All right, that's just about everything we need. Let's go ahead and, oops, can't use Firefox for this demo. Let's go ahead and use Chrome and bring in our player. And we'll hit play. And you'll notice the very slight movement, slow but sure, of the slider as the song continues. Now, it does stop when we stop, and it does pause when I pause the song. So I'll go ahead and pause. Notice it's not moving, and it'll continue moving when I hit play again. But there's something going on behind the scenes here that you should be aware of. I'm going to go ahead and open in Chrome what we call our developers tools. And one of the nice things about Chrome is it can give me a timeline and show me when different events occur. And these events you're seeing, every 100 milliseconds, are our interval. And even if I pause, the interval continues. So we're actually using resources here unnecessarily. Even if I stop, nothing stops this interval from running every 100 milliseconds. So that's a bad use of resources. So what we're going to want to do is, if the song is stopped, then we're going to want to, on myInterval, call clear interval. And that's going to actually stop our interval from running, and it's a much cleaner way to do this. All right, so let's also run the same thing on stop. Now let's do that same demo again. We'll bring it up here in our Chrome browser. And I'll also, oops, let me drag that in there. There we go. There's our Chrome browser. Let's also bring up our developers tools. These can be really, really handy, especially when you're testing before you go on to the device. Because on the device, any of these problems are magnified. All right, so we'll play. Turn that on there. And there you see the interval. I'm going to pause. It doesn't look like our interval clears. So let me take a look and see exactly what's wrong. And I can see I actually made a fairly common mistake. The way clear interval is used is not like this, but like this. Sometimes you get so used to that dot notation in object-oriented languages, you just kind of use it for anything. All right, so there's my interval. So let's go ahead and fix our friend down here so it's identical. So this should clear the interval, and now we'll see the correct results. Go ahead and save, and take a look here in one of our browsers, using Chrome again. And let's bring up the developer tools before we start. There they are. We'll start recording. I'll hit play, and you can see the activity. Pause. This time the interval is cleared, and you can see the activity is no longer occurring. But as soon as I hit play again, it's back, and we've stopped. So this is a much cleaner way to work with the intervals. So in this section, we've been able to control the music, play, pause, and stop, using JavaScript. Now, this is not the only JavaScript that can affect media. You can also control the volume and a few other elements using the JavaScript API.